Nature of this murder case, listener discretion is advised. This episode includes dramatizations and discussions of murder, suicidal ideation, assault, and rape that some people may find offensive. We advise extreme caution for children under 13.
Throughout the 1920s, America faced a stark cultural shift. The country moved from a conservative rural lifestyle to more lively urban consumer culture. Soon the time period became known as the Roaring Twenties.
There is perhaps no bigger symbol of this era than the flapper. Flappers were young party girls who lived in cities and were known for their stylish fashion and outrageous independence. They wore their hair in a short bob and donned knee-length dresses with plunging necklines.
Flappers were scandalous at the time, not only for their clothes, but also for their sexual freedom. These young women did not ascribe to America's rigid moral code. They drank, they danced, they smoked, and they partied just as hard as the men. Many more conservative-minded Americans thought these young women were dangerous to themselves and to society. Modern historians, however, consider flappers the first generation of independent American women.
New York City's Starr Faithfull was a quintessential flapper. She was glamorous, with movie star looks and a girlish charm. She loved to dance and drink, and stayed out late with men, often unchaperoned.
But there is a fine line between freedom and recklessness, and eventually Starr Faithfull crossed that line. She was found dead on June 8, 1931, still wearing her short, stylish dress from a few nights before. Despite her bright, cheery name, Starr Faithfull's life was troubled from the start. She was born Starr Wyman on January 26, 1906, in Evanston, Illinois. Her mother, Helen Pierce, came from old money, but did not inherit any of her family's fortune. Her father, Frank Wyman, was an unsuccessful investment broker who struggled to hold on to employment.
Less than a year after Starr's birth, Frank lost his job. The Wyman family was forced to move to Montclair, New Jersey, where Frank found work at a manufacturing firm. They could barely afford the small, furnished apartment they moved into.
Nevertheless, Helen, at least, was grateful for the move. Montclair was much closer to her wealthy relatives who lived in and around Boston, Massachusetts. As soon as Starr was old enough to walk, Helen took her up north to see them as often as she could.
Helen's relatives took pity on Helen and Starr, feeling guilty that Helen was penniless while they were still prospering. They often slipped the young mother some cash before she returned home.
While she was grateful to her relatives for the help, Helen resented having to beg for scraps because her husband did not make enough. The marriage soured, and Helen and Frank fought constantly, when he was home at least.
We're barely able to put food on the table. What kind of father are you?
Do you think I want this life? I work every day, and this is all I have to show for it.
Get a better job, then.
Like it's that easy. Why don't you get a job?
Oh, please. I have to beg my family for money just so we can scrape by.
You make it all sound so terrible here, Helen. Why don't you just run off then, Go out and find something better.
You'd like that, wouldn't you? Then you wouldn't be responsible for me, or our daughters.
What are you talking about?
I'm pregnant, Frank. So you better figure out how to get a better job. In 9 months, you'll have 3 mouths to feed.
On August 5th, 1911, Helen gave birth to a second baby girl, Elizabeth Wyman. Elizabeth went by her middle name, Tucker. Having a young baby in the house only increased the tension between Frank and Helen.
With her home life deteriorating, Starr and Tucker were often looked after by Helen's relatives in Boston. Eventually, Helen moved to a small family home on Cape Cod, where she raised the girls as a single mother.
Helen and her daughters began to rely more and more on their relatives' generosity. When it came time for Starr to go to school, Helen's aunt convinced the family to all chip in for Starr to go to a fancy private academy.
In her early years at Miss Julia Park's school in Boston, Starr was a happy, precocious child who rarely got into trouble.
With Frank more or less out of the picture, Helen trusted her 45-year-old cousin, Andrew J. Peters, as a sort of father figure for Starr. Andrew became mayor of Boston in 1917, and Helen thought he could be a good influence on Starr. Unfortunately, Helen's trust was misplaced.
Starting in 1917, when Starr was only 11 years old, Andrew began sexually abusing Starr. He often took Starr on long road trips. In the hotel rooms he booked along the way, Andrew gave Starr ether and molested her.
Although the abuse remained hidden, Starr's trauma began showing in different ways. In her teenage years, she became moody and introverted, a vast difference from the cheery, extroverted child she had been. She also began to dress differently, wearing masculine, oversized clothes to hide her body.
Starr became incredibly secretive, breaking off several friendships because the friends had asked her about her family. Not only were Starr's relationships suffering, so was her schooling. Starr had always been a voracious reader, but now she struggled to pay attention in class. Nevertheless, Starr completed her studies at Park School in 1921, when she was 15.
That fall, Starr was sent to a prestigious finishing school 30 miles north of Boston called Rogers Hall. Unfortunately, Rogers Hall was not far enough away for Starr to escape Andrew Peters' abuse.
Thank you so much for the invitation to dinner, Andrew. You have such a lovely home.
Of course, Helen. What is family for? On that matter, actually, I have a question to ask you. I'll be traveling north for business, and I know Starr's summer vacation is coming up, and I was wondering if I could pick her up for you.
Oh, that's so sweet. Are you sure that wouldn't be a bother? She can be quite a handful.
No, not a bother at all. In fact, if you don't mind, I was planning out a little road trip I could take Starr on for the summer.
Just you two?
Yes, just the two of us on the open road.
If you're sure you don't mind, I don't see a problem with it.
Andrew and Starr traveled alone together for 2 months, staying in over 10 different hotels. Remarkably, none of this raised the suspicions of Starr's mother, Helen.
Likely due to the abuse she suffered, Starr's performance at school continued to be erratic. She received mostly C's in classes and began to get into trouble with teachers. Her behavior was a cry for help, but unfortunately, no one noticed.
In 1924, when Starr turned 18, she decided to drop out of school altogether. She was only 5 months from graduating. Her family didn't question her decision. Everyone had written Starr off as a difficult teenager and didn't try to get to the root of her issues.
Starr's mother, for one, was too busy with her own problems to worry about her daughter. On May 26, 1924, Helen was granted a decree of divorce in a courthouse near Boston.
A few months later, she was engaged to a new man named Starr Faithfull, and on February 7, 1925, Helen and Stanley were married.
Although the wedding was less than 9 months after their mother's divorce, Starr was thrilled. Maybe this could finally be the fresh start that she had been looking for, a new father figure and a new home.
Starr now had the chance to reinvent herself. She could try to forget the abuse that seemed to follow her everywhere. Starr's transformation began with her last name.
Starr Faithfull. Isn't that a wonderful name? It sounds like a name from the movies.
Tucker Faithfull is almost as good, don't you think?
Girls, he's your stepfather. You don't need to take his last name.
If you're changing your name, why can't we?
I could never go back to Starr Wyman.
Starr was even more ecstatic when her mom and stepfather announced the family was moving to West Orange, New Jersey. At last, Starr would be out of Andrew's reach. Maybe now she could finally start to heal.
The Faithfull family moved into a small home in the center of the town. Despite the new surroundings, however, they struggled to make ends meet. Starr Faithfull was an entrepreneur, but most of his enterprises failed. Still, you would never guess that the family was short on cash from their lifestyle.
Starr especially appeared to live a very glamorous life. She often traveled to Manhattan and attended the city's hottest speakeasies, dressed in the latest fashion. She had blossomed into a beautiful young woman and loved the attention she got from men.
But the happy face she put on at parties was just a facade. Deep down, Starr was still haunted by her abuse. She often suffered erratic mood swings that caught everyone around her completely off guard.
Here, Starr. Try this one in blue.
I haven't had a new dress in ages. Thank you, Mother.
Well, you've gone through such a growth spurt. We had to do something before you burst right through the seams. No, this one won't do either. You're just too tall.
Ugh, why don't you just say it?
Starr, what's the matter?
You think I'm hideous, some kind of fat freak!
What are you talking about? Starr! Starr!
While some of these outbursts were simply confusing, others were downright frightening. At age 19, Starr was voluntarily committed to a Boston-area mental hospital for 9 days. Starr hid the true reason for her mental anguish and instead made up a story of a failed romance to the hospital's doctors.
When the psychiatrists released Starr to her parents, they suggested that Starr just needed a change of scenery.
Did she ever tell you what was the matter, Doctor? She is so private with us.
Something about a boy breaking her heart. You know how teenagers are.
Is she more stable now? She gets in such moods. She frightens her younger sister at times.
Yes, she's much calmer. You know, with cases like these, I often recommend a trip of some kind. New sights and experiences can reset the brain in remarkable ways. Should be like brand new, I promise.
I hope so. She's just not the happy little girl she used to be.
Helen and Stanley took the doctor's advice. A few weeks later, Starr and her younger sister, Tucker, were booked onto a 9-week cruise.
Tucker claimed that Starr's behavior was still erratic during the trip, but Starr was having the time of her life. The young woman fell in love with being on a cruise ship. Out in the open ocean, she felt like she could escape her troubles and just enjoy life.
Unfortunately, Starr could not run away from her problems forever. She would come face to face with her abuser once more. This time, Starr wouldn't keep quiet. On June 29, 1926, 20-year-old Starr Faithfull's troubled life in West Orange, New Jersey, was further rattled by a phone call. On the other side of the line was 54-year-old Andrew J. Peters, who had secretly molested Starr since she was a child.
Of course, Starr's mother, Helen, knew nothing about the abuse when she answered her home phone.
Faithful residence.
Helen? It's your cousin Andrew.
Oh, Andrew! It's been too long.
You won't believe it, but I'm actually in town. I have an extra ticket to a show in Manhattan. I know Starr adores theater, and I was hoping she could tag along with me.
Oh, I'm sure she would absolutely love that.
Great. I'll be sure to have her back by late this evening.
Despite Andrew's promise, Starr did not return to her home that evening after the show. Instead, Andrew claimed that the weather was too bad to travel back to West Orange and took Starr to his hotel.
That night, Andrew raped Starr. When Starr returned to the Faithfulls' home the next day, she was practically catatonic. Her stepfather, Stanley Faithfull, could tell right away that something was wrong.
Starr! There you are. How was the show?
Fine.
Starr, you look flush. Is something wrong?
I can't...
Did something bad happen? Starr, please. What can I do? Starr?
No one can do anything, Stanley.
Coincidentally, Starr's mother, Helen, was out visiting her cousin Andrew at his Manhattan hotel. As usual, she was asking for money, as she and Stanley were having trouble paying the mortgage on their West Orange home.
Andrew was not as helpful as Helen hoped, so she returned empty-handed and in poor spirits. But she couldn't help but notice her daughter seemed to be even worse off than her.
Behind closed doors, Helen spoke with Starr. For the first time, Starr broke her silence about the abuse she faced at the hands of her cousin.
Horrified, Helen learned that Andrew had molested her daughter repeatedly throughout her childhood. When Starr was only 11 years old, Andrew started reading Starr graphic sex manuals. Slowly, the abuse became more physical.
Andrew often made Starr sniff chloroform or ether to make her more compliant. When Andrew took Starr on road trips, they always stayed in the same room, and these trips were where most of the abuse occurred.
Helen was ashamed that she never sensed something was wrong. Andrew was a respected politician, so it never crossed her mind to question his motives. But now that she knew about the abuse, Starr's erratic behavior throughout her youth suddenly made more sense.
Helen and Stanley had no idea what to do with Starr's revelation. They thought of going to the police, but they worried about Starr becoming the center of a sex scandal. Because Andrew Peters was a notable figure, allegations of abuse would have made headlines. Starr was traumatized and mentally could not handle such attention.
Starr was scheduled for a cruise to Europe that was leaving the next day. Helen and Stanley agreed that their daughter should go ahead with the trip, as she needed time to recuperate.
On July 1st, 1926, Starr boarded a Cunard cruise ship bound for London. She wouldn't return back to the United States for 2 months.
While Starr was abroad, Stanley and Helen discussed what to do about Starr's mental state and how to deal with Andrew Peters.
Well, she clearly needs to see a specialist.
She's seen countless doctors already, and they weren't able to come to any sort of diagnosis.
But now we know the root of her issues. That will surely help.
You have to hope.
I just don't want her to be scarred for life from this. I want her to have a normal life. A specialist could help her.
Of course, I want the best for Starr, but specialists are expensive. Where are we gonna come up with that kind of money?
I don't think we should have to come up with the money. Andrew should pay for any treatments.
If you ask me, he should pay for a whole lot more than that.
Compared to the Faithfulls, Andrew J. Peters was incredibly wealthy. And Helen and Stanley thought it was only just for Andrew to pay for Starr's care.
Starr, meanwhile, was unable to stay out of trouble on her European cruise. She drank heavily and flirted with the men on board. She was stuck in a vicious circle. The only way she knew how to relieve her inner pain was to drink, but drinking led her to dangerous situations with men, thus reigniting her childhood trauma.
One evening, she drank so much she had to have her stomach pumped by the ship's surgeon, Dr. George Jameson Carr. As George nursed Starr back to health, she grew infatuated with him. At first, George thought it was just an innocent crush, but Starr visited him endlessly in his office during the rest of the cruise.
She told George all about her life, including the abuse she had been through. George was concerned for Starr, so he tried to stay cordial with her, even though he didn't return her feelings.
Even still, Starr continued to write love letters to George Carr for the rest of her life, often revealing her darkest secrets to the doctor. It is unclear whether the relationship was ever truly romantic.
Starr's sister Tucker claimed that Starr and George were in an on-and-off relationship. George, meanwhile, maintained he never had any sort of romantic relationship with Starr. He explained,
You don't become romantic about a girl on whom you used a stomach pump the first time you saw her.
Once Starr returned home in the fall of 1926, she began to see a new psychiatrist, but it was expensive.
Starr's stepfather, in particular, was determined to get money out of Andrew for Starr's treatment. In 1927, Stanley hired a lawyer to seek a settlement.
Andrew denied any wrongdoing and claimed that his relationship with Starr was never inappropriate. Stanley then hired a private eye who found evidence that Starr was often booked in the same room as Andrew on their trips.
While Stanley claimed to just be seeking reimbursement for Starr's therapy, his tactics began to resemble blackmail. Andrew Peters was currently being considered as a candidate for Massachusetts governor and couldn't afford a scandal. So when Andrew's lawyer refused to settle for $25,000, Stanley wrote a terse letter in reply.
I have definitely decided that the only thing to do is to take the matter up with the district attorney here. We are more interested in the moral than the financial aspect of the matter. We therefore wish to talk the matter over with a few prominent people in Boston who will not be biased in favor of Mr. Peters, and then decide what to do.
Stanley's tactics worked, and on June 30th, 1927, Andrew Peters agreed to pay the Faithfulls $25,000 on the condition that Starr, Stanley, and Helen sign non-disclosure agreements. $25,000 was a small fortune in 1927, the equivalent of over $360,000 today.
While the settlement made the Faithfulls momentarily wealthy, keeping Starr happy was expensive. Over the next few years, Starr saw multiple therapists and psychiatrists.
In the end, the only thing that seemed to calm their daughter down were long European cruises. She went on 6 ocean voyages in 3 years.
Not helping matters financially, Stanley barely worked. Ostensibly, he was a mattress salesman, but he made almost no money. Instead, the Faithfulls lived off Andrew's settlement and the generosity of Helen's relatives.
Despite their money woes, the Faithfulls did not live a modest life. In 1929, they moved to a brownstone in Manhattan's Greenwich Village. The neighborhood was pretty swanky at the time. In fact, New York City's mayor lived only 6 doors down from the Faithfulls.
Starr and her sister Tucker were thrilled to finally be living in the big city. Being closer to the center of the action, Starr partied even more than she used to. She would sometimes disappear for hours at a time and occasionally overnight.
While Starr was finally out of Andrew Peters' grip, she couldn't seem to shake the tragedies of her youth. She often turned to the bottle in an effort to get the dark thoughts out of her head. It seemed like all the therapy in the world couldn't stop Starr's self-destructive tendencies.
Starr gained a reputation as a socialite and drunk, especially on the Cunard cruise ship parties she frequented. She would often attend the Bon Voyage festivities on the ships before they departed, making a scene by over-drinking. Occasionally, she would drunkenly try to stow away in order to get a free trip to Europe.
Starr had a thing for cruise ship workers, striking up relationships with several ship officers and doctors. She even started a fling with Dr. George Carr's former assistant, Dr. Raymond Lancaster.
Raymond, who lived in London, suggested to Starr that she run away from home to join him in England. But when she did, Raymond broke up with her within days, stranding Starr in Europe.
Desperate to get back home, Starr snuck into a ship heading to America. She knew George was working on board and could help her.
Starr? What are you doing here? I told you can't stow away like this anymore.
I had no other choice, George, I swear.
Well, you'll need to buy a ticket or you'll be removed.
Please, George, you don't understand. I'm stuck here. I've no money. I'm begging you. This is my only option. It's either this or I jump overboard.
Get off your knees, Starr. There's no need to beg. I'll pay your fare, but I expect your parents to repay me.
Oh, thank you, George. Thank you.
As the years went by, Starr's relationships with men did not get any better. One psychiatrist suggested that Starr needed sex therapy so that she could have a better association to sex and therefore men in general.
The method of this therapy was a bit unorthodox, but Helen and Stanley were desperate to help Starr in any way. They could tell that she was spiraling out of control, so, following the doctor's advice, Starr's parents hired a local artist as a sex tutor.
Starr, meanwhile, had no idea that she was being tutored. Instead, she thought she was having a genuine relationship with the man. Instead of helping, it only led to more heartbreak and more trouble for Starr.
On March 30th, 1930, police were called to a Manhattan hotel where they found an unconscious naked woman passed out on a bed. With her was a man who claimed to be her husband.
The woman was Starr Faithfull, and the man was definitely not her husband. Starr woke up in Bellevue Hospital where doctors diagnosed her with acute alcoholism. She was covered in bruises and could not remember the name of the man she had been with. Helen and Stanley were distraught that nothing they tried to do seemed to help their daughter. Starr's behavior was becoming more and more reckless, and her actions would prove to be dangerous. Her fire was burning too fast, and soon it would be snuffed out.
Coming up, we'll examine the events leading up to Starr Faithfull's untimely death. And now, back to our story.
May 29th, 1931 was an unseasonably hot day in Manhattan, New York. 25-year-old Starr Faithfull braved the sweaty crowds at Chelsea Piers and boarded a Cunard cruise ship named the RMS Franconia. She did not have a ticket.
As she made her way up the gangplank, she looked all around for any sign of her longtime crush, Dr. George Jameson Carr, who worked as a Cunard ship surgeon. As she wandered the boat's deck, she bumped into the assistant cruise director, Francis Peabody Hamlin.
Starr was on cruises so frequently that Francis immediately recognized her. After exchanging pleasantries, Starr asked Francis to take her to see George in his office on board. He warily obliged, knowing that Starr often caused a lot of drama on the cruises she attended.
A few hours later, Francis saw Starr wandering the hallways, looking distraught.
Starr, are you okay?
Oh, Francis, Dr. Carr refused to see me.
He's probably just busy. He may have a patient.
I feel awfully faint. Could you get me some brandy to steady my nerves?
I'm not sure that's a good idea.
Ugh, everyone thinks I'm a nuisance, especially Dr. Carr. I should just throw myself overboard.
Don't be foolish. Come on. I'll find you some brandy, okay?
At 5 p.m., the ship departed the docks. The captain didn't realize he had a stowaway on board.
Starr, meanwhile, visited George Carr's consultation office once again. George knew Starr was not supposed to be on board and scolded her. Distraught, Starr ran off to hide, determined to conceal herself until it was too late for the ship to turn around.
George reported to an officer that they had a stowaway on board, prompting an all-hands search of the boat. Starr was found within minutes, drunk and crying in the corner of a hallway.
A tugboat reached the ship about 10 minutes later, and Starr was escorted onto it. She drunkenly fought with the crew as they carried her onto the boat.
Don't touch me! Stop! Don't you understand? I have to get to London. I have to!
Ma'am, you have no ticket, you have no passport. You wouldn't be allowed into England even if you got there.
I'll work. I'll clean dishes, anything.
Ma'am, if you don't come with us, we'll have to carry you.
I'm not coming.
Ma'am, stop resisting!
Kill me! Throw me overboard! I can't go back!
Starr continued to shout and cry as the tugboat reached the shore. Once on land, she was thrown into a taxi and returned to her family home in Greenwich Village. As Starr stumbled into the house, her parents somehow didn't notice that Starr had been drinking.
While Starr's family was concerned about her hard partying ways, they were easily duped. Starr had become a great liar and a master at hiding her drinking.
On June 3rd, Starr once again made up a story about where she was headed. She claimed that she was attending an artist's party with Francis Hamlin. According to Starr, several famous movie and theater stars would be in attendance. No such party ever occurred.
The next day, Starr continued her fabrication, saying she was again going out with Francis. She claimed that they met at the Savoy Plaza Hotel. Francis later maintained that he never met Starr privately in his life.
Starr's lies were a cover-up for a secret rendezvous she was having with Dr. Charles Young Roberts, a cruise ship surgeon. Charles took Starr to a speakeasy where Starr asked for Charles' help running away from home. She also took advantage of the free-flowing alcohol.
Although they weren't good at seeing through Starr's lies, Starr's family still worried about her behavior. Every time she returned home, they could smell she had been drinking.
Starr, would you like to see a movie with Mother and I later? There's supposed to be an excellent one playing at the Roxy.
I've already agreed to meet Francis at 9:45.
Where are you meeting this boy?
At his hotel.
Starr, that's hardly proper. I really wish you wouldn't go out tonight.
And why shouldn't I?
You don't hide the smell of booze as well as you think, Starr.
You know what I've been through, sister.
It's not an excuse for being a drunkard.
Enough. I'm putting my foot down. You are not leaving this house.
You can't make me stay.
Starr, just listen to Mother.
No! I'll do whatever I like!
Tucker went so far as to reset all the clocks in the home in an effort to mess with Starr's date. She hoped that if her sister showed up too late, the man she was meeting would give up and leave. Unfortunately, Tucker's scheme didn't work.
On June 5th, 1931, Starr left home at 9:30 a.m. wearing a paisley Lord & Taylor dress and a stylish hat. Her stepfather Stanley gave her $3 to get her hair waved. Just before closing the front door, Starr told her mother she would be home by early evening.
After leaving the house, Starr headed straight to Chelsea Piers, where all of the Cunard ships were docked. At around 1 p.m., Starr and a man in a Cunard uniform, whom she called Brucey, entered a cab near the docks that drove them to the Faithfulls' address.
We're here.
Okay, Starr, time to go.
I don't want to go home.
Starr.
Okay, Brucey, fine. I'll see you at 4, Brucey. On the wharf?
Don't come back to the dock, Starr.
Whoever this Brucey was, Starr did not listen to him. At around 2 p.m., the same cab driver picked Starr up again from the Cunard docks. Starr seemed drunk. This time Brucey was even more adamant that Starr not return.
Good to see you again, sir. Where are we taking her this time?
Same place.
Got it.
Brucey, please.
Don't let her come back here.
Once again, Starr did not listen. When the cab driver dropped her off at her apartment, she did not enter her house. Instead, she began to walk in the direction of the piers.
She walked several blocks to a hair salon in Grand Central Station, where she asked to get an appointment to have her hair waved. The clerk scheduled Starr for later that afternoon, but she never showed up.
A few hours later, Starr was back at Chelsea Piers. At around 5 p.m., she went aboard the RMS Carmania, looking for Dr. Charles Young Roberts. Charles met with Starr in his private quarters. After much pleading, Charles gave Starr a little brandy.
Starr and the doctor had a small dinner, and Starr left the boat willingly at around 10 p.m. As she stepped into a taxi, she told Charles that she was going to head to a bon voyage party on a nearby ship.
Starr was not seen for the rest of that evening. Her family was worried sick. Starr had promised she would be back well before dark.
On June 6th, Stanley reported Starr missing to the local police station.
How can I help you, sir?
I would like to report my daughter missing. Well, a stepdaughter, technically.
How long has she been missing?
Since yesterday morning?
Just yesterday?
Yes, but it's highly unusual.
What's her age?
20, as of January.
I don't think you have anything to worry about, sir. She's probably out with a boyfriend or something.
She's not that kind of girl.
She's never stayed out overnight before?
Never. Well, occasionally. But I'd still like to report it.
I'll make a note of it for the Missing Person Bureau. But I should tell you, nothing will be done about it for a couple of days at least. I really don't think you have anything to worry about. Girls that say stay out overnight all the time.
Despite reassurances from police, Stanley was right to worry. Just 2 days later, Starr Faithfull would be found dead. Her body washed up on a beach in Long Island, New York.
On October 29, 1929, the Roaring Twenties came to a screeching halt. The American stock market bottomed out, beginning a chain of countless bankruptcies and widespread unemployment that would ultimately lead to the Great Depression, a period of economic stagnation where thriftiness was valued above all else.
But not everyone was ready to give up the glitz and glamour of the 20s. Even though she and her family were broke, 25-year-old Starr Faithfull developed a particularly expensive taste for cruise ships.
For Starr, being on a cruise was like being in a different world. Prohibition made the sale and consumption of alcohol illegal, but plenty of ships still provided free-flowing booze. She could drink all she wanted, float on the water, and forget the troubles that plagued her normal life.
The ocean made Starr feel alive, and yet, in a tragic twist of fate, it's also what killed her. On June 8, 1931, a man named Daniel Moriarty took his daily stroll down the sandy coast of Long Beach, New York. The tiny strip of land right off the south shore of Long Island was a trendy summer getaway at the time.
Daniel woke up early to comb the sand for forgotten trinkets and treasures. He hadn't been very lucky that morning. There were no coins and no jewelry, nothing more than a few broken seashells.
A storm the previous weekend had scared island visitors away. Without tourists, Daniel had little hope of finding anything worthwhile. Nevertheless, he kept his eyes glued to the ground.
He saw a large lump of fabric in the distance. Getting closer, he thought that perhaps a beachgoer had left their blanket on a piece of driftwood.
But then Daniel saw what looked like pale white fingers. With horror, he realized that he'd stumbled on a body.
Daniel stared at the corpse, his eyes wide. It was a woman. She wore a silk dress, patterned in blue paisley and paired with silk stockings. Her auburn hair was tangled with sand. Her fingernails were bright red, freshly painted. She didn't have on shoes or undergarments.
Daniel crouched next to the body. The woman might have been dead, but she still deserved respect. He pulled down the bottom of her dress so her legs wouldn't be as exposed.
Then Daniel ran to two nearby beachcombers to ask for help. He was practically incomprehensible, but the men knew something bad had happened. One sprinted away to get a police officer.
Soon, Nassau County detectives swarmed the beach looking for clues. The dead woman had no purse or ID. The police had no idea who she was or what had happened to her.
That afternoon, Stanley Faithfull, Starr's stepfather, sat in his home in Manhattan. He sipped a cup of coffee and read the newspaper. He felt perfectly at ease, until he saw an article about an unidentified body in Long Beach.
The Faithfull family hadn't heard from Starr in 2 days. Starr's disappearance wasn't unusual for her erratic behavior, but still the article made Stanley's stomach drop. He couldn't help but think the worst, so he traveled to Long Beach and spoke to a Nassau County detective.
Excuse me, officer. I had a question regarding the body that was found this morning.
Look, pal, the lieutenant told the press no comment, and I don't got nothing to add.
I'm not a journalist. Was the woman wearing a blue dress by chance?
How'd you know that?
Was it Paisley?
Who did you hear this from?
Oh no. It's her.
Who?
Starr. My stepdaughter. I can't believe it.
The officer took Stanley to Harold King, Nassau County's lead investigator. King showed Stanley the paisley dress, and Stanley said he was certain it belonged to Starr.
Inspector King then drove Stanley to the morgue. King lifted the sheet that covered the body, revealing the woman's face. Stanley tearfully confirmed what he already knew. His stepdaughter was dead.
With the body identified, the investigation jumped into high gear. A local doctor performed the initial autopsy. He found a small number of bruises on Starr's body and a few lacerations on her liver. He wrote off the injuries as damage from floating in the ocean.
Originally, police suspected Starr died of an accidental drowning or suicide. But Stanley insisted they were wrong. He swore Starr wasn't suicidal, so Inspector King agreed to look into the possibility of foul play.
On June 9th, King ordered a second, more detailed autopsy. Dr. Otto Schulze, a renowned medical examiner, found signs of over 100 injuries on Starr's body, including abrasions, scratches, and bruises. He also found another, even more important piece of evidence.
Mr. King, I was hoping you would stop by. Whoever it was who did that first autopsy, well, to be frank, he missed quite a lot.
Really?
Yes, there was water in the lungs, but there was also sand.
Okay. What does that mean?
When a person drowns, they breathe in water. The place Starr drowned must have been very sandy. In other words, very shallow.
So she didn't say jump off a boat?
Oh, certainly not. In fact, I'd say she either fell into the ocean unconscious, or someone held her head underwater. Oh, and Mr. King, the bruises on Starr's body didn't happen post-mortem. They occurred before she died. I would guess she was in a physical altercation, a fight of some kind.
The second autopsy painted a totally different picture of Starr's death. According to Schulze, she appeared to have been in a fight before drowning in shallow water. Although Inspector King was still skeptical, the findings certainly seemed to suggest foul play.
The district attorney of Nassau County, Elvin Edwards, agreed. He believed Starr's death was a murder, but he needed to know more about her personal life and who might want to hurt her. So he set up an interview with Starr Faithfull.
Thank you for meeting me on such short notice, Mr. Faithfull.
Of course. Anything to help the investigation.
Let's get down to it. Do you have any reason to believe Starr committed suicide?
Absolutely not. She loved life.
Did she have a bad temper?
No, not at all. We got along terrifically.
Did Starr have any close romantic attachments?
None. I can't think of a single man that Starr was close to.
Nearly everything Starr Faithfull said in the interview was a lie. He made his stepdaughter out to be a model young woman, when in reality she was moody, quick to anger, and had numerous flings with men.
Stanley might have lied because he was hiding something, or more likely, he may have just been protecting his stepdaughter's image.
In fact, Stanley made it clear that Starr was a victim. While he hid her more unsavory behavior, he was very forthcoming about one aspect of her life: her abuse at the hands of 59-year-old Andrew J. Peters.
Elvin Edwards was horrified to hear that Starr had been molested by her older cousin. He said,
Mr. Faithfull said that there had been in the life of this girl a man, politician who was related to the family and lived in Boston. The man's relationship with her had been of the very worst kind, of the most sordid nature, and by virtue of the circumstances surrounding the contact between Starr as a child and this man, he believed that this man was the logical suspect as her murderer, the type of man that would be inclined to do away with her.
Edwards agreed with Stanley. Andrew was a prime suspect. It wasn't hard to believe that Starr's childhood abuser was also her killer.
The same day that Edwards interviewed Stanley, another breakthrough piece of evidence materialized.
Otto Schulze, the medical examiner, found no alcohol in Starr's system. This was strange, as she was known to drink heavily. Furthermore, her stomach contained a partially digested meal of steak, mushrooms, and potatoes. According to Schulze, the food must have been eaten 3 to 4 hours before her death.
Schulze was also surprised to discover a significant amount of Alonil in Starr's system. Alonil is a strong barbiturate drug that would make a person dizzy and sleepy at such high quantities. The sedative was rarely prescribed by doctors because it was dangerous and addictive.
This made Starr's death even more mysterious. Apparently, on the day she died, Starr hadn't had any liquor, but she had taken a powerful barbiturate.
The Alonil could account for how Starr drowned in shallow water. If she took enough of the sedative, she might have fallen unconscious. Still, it wasn't clear if Starr ingested the substance on purpose or if she was drugged.
Stanley Faithfull fervently believed it was the second option. He claimed that Andrew J. Peters gave Starr sedatives like Alonil when he abused her.
With that information, Investigator King and District Attorney Edwards finally agreed that it was time to turn their attention towards the politician. On June 10, 1931, Investigator Harold King and District Attorney Elvin Edwards traveled from New York to Massachusetts. They were there to scope out the primary suspect in 25-year-old Starr Faithfull's possible murder, her second cousin, 59-year-old Andrew J. Peters.
King and Edwards tried to keep their travel under wraps, but Andrew somehow knew they were coming. When Edwards got to his hotel room, the phone rang almost immediately.
Hello?
Is this District Attorney Edwards?
Yes.
This is Alexander Whiteside. I have reason to believe that you endeavored to interview Andrew Peters regarding a recently deceased person, Starr Faithfull.
I'm afraid I do not discuss police matters over the phone, even with legal counsel.
I am not Mr. Peters' lawyer. He does not need one. I am acting as his friend. He has assured me he would be glad to give any evidence he had, but he has none.
Even so, I would like to interview him tomorrow.
Mr. Edwards, a citizen from one state cannot be compelled to give evidence in a case whose jurisdiction is within another state. I trust you now understand the legal situation.
The call made it clear that Andrew wasn't going to cooperate, and it made Edwards even more suspicious. He asked Boston area police to tail Andrew. Towards the end of the evening, officers watched the politician pack a number of items from his office and speed out of town.
Despite this strange behavior, the further police looked into Andrew, the less likely it seemed that he killed Starr. He was at his summer home in Maine around the time that she died.
Still, Andrew Peters was a wealthy and powerful politician. He could have paid someone to murder Starr. Whether the culprit was Andrew, a hitman, or someone else altogether, Edwards was now certain that Starr had been the victim of a homicide, and he was ready to go on the record about it.
Mr. Edwards, did you get any leads here in Boston? Are you certain that Starr was murdered?
I am certain that she did not commit suicide. Dr. Otto Schulze is of the same opinion.
This was a marked shift. The inquiry into Starr Faithfull's death was officially a murder investigation.
In New York, Detective Joseph Culkin searched the Faithfull residence for clues. Her bedroom was tiny, but filled to the brim with clothes and shoes. Culkin searched the pockets of all her clothing and came up empty.
Then he turned his attention to Starr's bookshelf. He pulled out a collection of poems, and a small notebook tumbled off the shelf.
Culkin had hit the jackpot. It was Starr's diary. As he flipped through the pages of the journal, he realized Starr wasn't the girl her family made her out to be.
This is the dumbest family. Stanley's pathetic and sick. Mother's pathetic. Tucker is vicious. I got drunk with the right boy. I got horribly drunk. I certainly am a temperamental person. Yesterday I was depressed, and tonight after a rough fight with Mother, I am wildly happy. Oh, Edwin has fallen for me at last. He seemed anxious to spend another night of love. Tonight I thought how horrible it would be to get old and die. I've decided I shall never get old.
The diary revealed that Starr drank heavily and was often depressed. It also confirmed that there were many men in her life, and thus many possible suspects in her murder.
According to local newspapers, Starr had trysts with 19 different gentlemen between 1926 and 1929.
Extra, extra! Read all about it! Starr Faithfull, party girl, dozens of paramours!
Soon, Starr Faithfull's name was known across the globe. Her story was even featured in Time magazine.
With the increased publicity, District Attorney Elvin Edwards felt a massive amount of pressure to solve the case. And soon, he'd make news with a dramatic announcement at Starr's funeral.
On June 11th, 1931, the Faithfull family sat in a small chapel in Queens. Along with Starr's biological father, they were the only relatives in attendance. The rest of the pews were filled with reporters and nosy onlookers.
Starr Faithfull's body lay in a brown and white casket. The Reverend started reading from his prayer book, and then there was a commotion outside.
2 men burst through the chapel's doors.
Excuse us, folks. The funeral will be postponed till further notice.
Elvin Edwards had ordered Starr Faithfull's body to be returned to the morgue, stopping the memorial service in its tracks.
Edwards needed the corpse because he'd found 4 men who said they saw Starr on June 5th, the night of her disappearance. He needed these potential witnesses to see the body and confirm their stories.
But after taking a look, all 4 backed off their claims. Apparently, they'd been mistaken. Edwards had crashed the funeral for nothing. Detectives were right back where they started.
As far as investigators knew, the last person to see Starr Faithfull alive was Police Sergeant Patrick Dugan. Dugan was working at Chelsea Piers in Manhattan on June 5th.
At around 10:20 p.m., Dugan saw Starr next to a stocky man who he assumed worked for Cunard Cruise Lines. According to Dugan, Starr seemed drunk. After a few moments, the stocky man put Starr in a cab and the car drove off.
No taxi driver ever came forward, despite rewards offered by the press and the police. Starr's whereabouts after 10:20 p.m. remained a mystery.
But the stocky man who worked for Cunard Cruises was an important lead. According to Starr's mother and sister, Starr was desperately in love with a ship's surgeon named Dr. George Jameson Carr. Perhaps he was the mysterious gentleman. If so, George could give investigators important information, like where Starr's taxi was headed.
But George was in Belgium on holiday. It would take several days to contact him, and many more to get him to New York for questioning.
In the meantime, the Faithfull family was getting desperate, and not just for information about Starr. The Great Depression had decimated their finances, and they were looking for any way to make money. So they sold their side of the story to the New York World Telegram for $800, the equivalent of about $14,000 today.
In the article, Stanley Faithfull confirmed that a Boston area politician had abused Starr as a child. He also suggested that the powerful man was a family member. It didn't take long for the press to connect the dots to Andrew J. Peters.
Just 2 days later, Andrew suffered a nervous breakdown and was admitted to a Boston hospital. A few days later, he left the emergency room and traveled to his summer home to avoid the press. The New York Daily News reported Andrew's health crisis scandalously.
Peters collapsed completely, his nerves a wreck as the ghost of his past, the ghosts of his sordid affair with Starr, came crowding in on his memories. With his family, the former mayor of Boston is still in seclusion in North Haven. There he lies, broken, disconsolate, and inaccessible.
As the press frenzy continued, so did the investigation. On June 22, 1931, Dr. George Carr finally reached Manhattan. Inspector Harold King and District Attorney Elvin Edwards couldn't wait to question the man who Starr had reportedly been in love with. Surely George could help them find the killer.
But George's interrogation did the exact opposite. It rekindled the theory that Starr's death was a suicide.
Perhaps the investigation had been a wild goose chase the entire time.
Up next, we explore whether Starr's death was a murder or suicide and try to solve the case ourselves. Now, back to the story.
On June 22, 1931, Dr. George Jameson Carr arrived in Manhattan on the Cunard cruise ship, the RMS Laconia.
When she was alive, 25-year-old Starr Faithfull was hopelessly in love with George Carr. While he didn't return her affection, he was still fond of her.
This personal connection made Dr. George Carr a person of interest in Starr's murder investigation. When he stepped off the docks at Chelsea Piers, investigator Harold King and District Attorney Elvin Edwards whisked him away to record a deposition.
Dr. Carr, can you tell us about your interactions with Starr Faithfull?
I met her on a number of occasions, and she often spoke of confidential matters.
Such as?
I learned of her experiences with Mr. Peters. She also told me about taking ether and hypnotic drugs. That poor girl. She said she got an enormous kick out of ether. Said it made her forget her past.
If what George said was true, it could explain the alonol found in Starr's liver. Perhaps she'd taken the drug recreationally.
While George did know a suspicious number of details about Starr, his alibi was airtight. He'd been at sea on the Cunard cruise ship, the RMS Franconia, several days before and after Starr's disappearance.
Still, investigators hoped George could shine a light on Starr's final hours. Luckily for them, George thought he knew the true identity of the stocky man.
I have heard from others in the Cunard company that Miss Faithfull was at a party at Dr. Charles Roberts' cabin until late on the night of her disappearance.
Before King and Edwards could look into Roberts, George presented them with 3 letters he'd received from Starr, written in the days preceding her death. In one letter, posted on May 30th, 1931, Starr wrote about her depression and her desire to die by suicide.
I'm going to end my worthless, disorderly bore of an existence before I ruin anyone else's life as well. I certainly have made a sordid, futureless mess of it all. I'm dead sick of it.
Then Starr wrote about both murder and suicide in a letter she posted on June 4th, just one day before her disappearance.
If one wants to get away with murder, one has to jolly well keep one's wits about one. It's the same way with suicide. I intend to watch out and accomplish my end this time. No ether, alonal, or window jumping. I don't want to be maimed. I want oblivion.
When the press caught wind of the letters, they chalked up Starr Faithfull's death to suicide. Starr's name vanished from tabloids as quickly as it had appeared.
But Stanley Faithfull wasn't ready to move on. He alleged that the suicidal letters were forgeries. He was proven wrong, but he still believed Starr had been murdered.
District Attorney Elvin Edwards also wasn't ready to close the case because there were several inconsistencies in Starr's notes to George Carr. In the May 30th letter, Starr had begged George to see her again, something that wouldn't be possible if she was dead. Starr said she wouldn't take alonol, yet the drug had been found in her system.
Something didn't add up. So throughout the late summer and early fall, the police continued chasing leads. Tips came in nearly every day.
Most of the information led to dead ends. At various times, Starr was rumored to be a call girl, a gangster's girlfriend, and a burlesque dancer. None of this gossip actually got officers closer to the truth.
In October of 1931, police got a possible break in the case. Investigators interviewed several witnesses who claimed to have seen Starr Faithfull on June 6th, one day after her disappearance. These informants were sure Starr had been at Taps Hotel in Island Park, New York.
Island Park is right next to Long Beach, where Starr's body was found. Even more intriguing, Taps Hotel was a known hangout for many of New York City's top gangsters.
The hotel owners claimed they saw a man get rough with Starr Faithfull before they both disappeared from the bar. Others corroborated the story, but no one was willing to go on record about the man's identity.
Investigators suspected that it was Vanny Higgins, a notorious bootlegger and gangster who supplied Taps with illicit liquor. In interviews, police tried to get workers to rat on Vanny.
Mr. Berg, what can you tell me about this man you saw with Starr Faithfull?
I don't want to get mixed up in a murder scandal.
Can you at least confirm you saw Starr?
Sure, but I'd be of no use in your case. I'm not testifying to nothing.
Are you afraid of Vanny Higgins, Mr. Berg? Is that why you're being so cagey?
Of course not! I'm not afraid of any man.
As hard as they tried, investigators couldn't get anyone to go on the record. If Vanny Higgins was somehow involved in Starr's death, he'd scared every witness into silence.
Ultimately, police dropped the Taps Hotel angle. Nobody would talk. Plus, officers had no idea why Starr would have gone to Island Park, or how she might have gotten there.
With no fresh leads, the investigators returned to an old one. On December 7th, 1931, the police finally questioned Dr. Charles Roberts. According to George Carr, Roberts was with Starr on the evening of her disappearance.
It's unclear why it took investigators several months to interview Roberts, especially considering that his testimony closed the case for good.
How did Starr appear on that Friday, June 5th?
She seemed much the same as usual. She was always sort of, what shall I say, unhappy. I think her affair with George Carr was in the back of her mind. She was anxious to go to Paris, to get away from it all.
Did she ask you to help her stow away?
Oh, no, not at all.
Is there anything else you can recollect from your Friday conversation?
She talked about a ship, the Ile-de-France. Thinking it over, I'm sure she had a date there at 10 o'clock. She was going to a party on board. The ship was sailing that night to Havre, I think. That's the shortest way of getting to Paris.
What did you two have for dinner that night?
We had boiled eggs and ham sandwiches. And either milk or coffee.
No meat, mushrooms, or potatoes?
No.
Was she influenced by some drug when she left you?
Not that I observed, no.
Now, upon her leave-taking, you escorted her to a taxi?
Yes. It was just after 10 p.m. I did not give any address to the taxi man, and I did not hear what she said to him. That's the last I ever saw of her. I'm sure it was in her mind to go to the Ile-de-France.
Roberts suggested Starr was desperate to get to Europe. The police also knew that Starr had tried to stow away on a cruise ship before. From those two facts, District Attorney Edwards concocted a new theory.
The DA's office theorized that Starr had stowed away on the Ile-de-France. She emerged from her hiding spot delirious from Alonal she'd taken recreationally. Somewhere on the waters off Long Beach, she'd gone to the edge of the ship and either jumped or fallen to her death.
This theory was never publicized, but it was enough to satisfy police. On December 7th, 1931, the inquiry into Starr's death was closed.
But while Edwards accepted the Ile-de-France theory, this explanation for Starr's death was extraordinarily flimsy.
During the investigation, police questioned several crew members and passengers on the Ile-de-France. No one remembered seeing Starr Faithfull.
There was also a major issue with the theory's timeline. The Ile-de-France departed from Manhattan at 10 p.m. The same time Starr ended her visit with Roberts. She couldn't have stowed away on the ship in mere minutes.
The geography also made no sense. The Ile-de-France was docked right next to Dr. Roberts' ship. Starr wouldn't have needed a taxi for a 2-minute walk.
Lastly, it's unclear where Starr would have gotten the Alonol that was in her system when she died, and when she would have had time to eat steak and potatoes. It's hard to believe she had a sit-down meal while stowed away on a ship.
Clearly, this explanation was insufficient, and a lot of people knew it. Morris Markey, a writer at The New Yorker, had his own theory, one based on Starr's tumultuous sex life.
It is not too fantastic to suggest that on the final day of her life, Starr allowed herself to be picked up by an attractive stranger, and that she agreed to his suggestion that they go to Long Beach. I think they did not go to a room, but found a lonely spot on that almost endless stretch of shadowed sand. She discarded all her clothing except the thin silk dress, and then, I think, she teased this unknown man beyond endurance. He mauled her, perhaps into unconsciousness. Then he was frightened because he had mauled her and decided that she would never tell of it. So he took her down to the water's edge and held her head under.
Besides Starr's body being found in Long Beach with no undergarments, there's not much evidence to back up Markey's hypothesis. Although if Markey was correct, Starr's death was a tragic repetition of the sexual violence of her youth.
Jonathan Goodman, the author of The Passing of Starr Faithfull, also proposed an elaborate theory to explain her death. Goodman believes Starr had been the victim of a blackmailing scheme gone wrong.
Starr was abducted, driven to Island Park to Taps Hotel, the favorite watering place of the Vanny Higgins gang. Starr was treated quite well at first. She was given a meal and was provided with a Lonel. She was told she had no need to be frightened. Once she had dished the dirt, every speck, on Andrew Peters, she would be driven back to Manhattan. She talked. But Vanny Higgins was not satisfied, and so Vanny Higgins tried to beat the truth out of her.
Goodman's hypothesis had some supporting clues. Rumor had it that a Boston-area gang had blackmailed Andrew Peters out of $30,000. If that was true, it stands to reason that a New York gangster like Vanny Higgins might want in on a blackmailing scheme of his own.
Plus, multiple witnesses claim to have seen Starr Faithfull in Island Park at Taps Hotel the night after her disappearance. The only problem is, none of these bystanders agreed to go on the record.
So, to this day, Starr's death remains an enigma. It might have been a terrible accident, a tragic suicide, or a cold-blooded murder.
With all the available evidence, I think Starr's abusive cousin, Andrew J. Peters, was responsible for her death. Starr knew he was a predator, which made her a threat to his political career. Even though he was in Maine at the time of her death, he still could have orchestrated her murder.
I'm not so sure. I think the theory that Vanny Higgins' gang was involved makes more sense. They hung out in Taps Hotel, and multiple witnesses saw Starr there. The gang could explain a lot. They might have treated Starr to a steak dinner and given her a Lonel to gain her trust and get information about Andrew Peters. Then, when they had enough information for political blackmail, they might have killed Starr to keep her from ratting out their scheme.
Whatever the truth about her death may be, Starr Faithfull's life was defined by a tragic cycle of abuse. Beginning when she was just 11 years old, she was molested by her adult cousin. She could never fully heal from the physical and psychological trauma that Andrew Peters inflicted on her.
Whether she died by accident, suicide, or murder, Starr's heavy drinking, drug abuse, and eventual death can be linked to this early victimization.
She deserved better from start to finish.